Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a panel discussion about the film Entangled, presented by the New England Aquarium and GlobeDocs. My name is Vicki Spruill, and I'm the president and CEO at the New England Aquarium, and I'm delighted to be kicking us off this evening. The New England Aquarium has three major parts. We're a public-facing aquarium and education center located on Boston's Central Wharf, which is where you'll find our 20,000 animals. A research arm called the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life, and a sea turtle rescue program located in Quincy, Massachusetts. Tonight, we're here to talk about an animal that our Anderson Cabot Center scientists have been studying for decades. In fact, this is actually their 40th year of doing this important work. We're delighted and honored to have these esteemed panelists and all of you here this evening for a discussion about the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. Tonight's event is made possible with generous support from the Lowell Institute, which allows the aquarium to offer programs like this free of charge. We're deeply grateful to have their support each season. Journalist and documentary filmmaker David Abel, attorney Erica Fuller of the Conservation Law Foundation, fisherman Rob Martin, and scientist Dr. Peter Corcoran, and all of us at the New England Aquarium share a deep interest in the fate of the right whale. Even though scientific research indicates there are only 356 right whales alive today, we believe there is hope for the species, especially with so many people coming together as we are this evening to learn about how to protect them. But there is much work to be done. Dr. Peter Corcoran chairs the Krause Marine Mammal Conservation Program in our Anderson Cabot Center. He and his team work with industry, fishermen, and others to develop and implement solutions to reduce the threats of vessel strikes and fishing gear entanglements and protect the remaining right whales in our own backyard. Through his reporting and filmmaking, David Abel has delved into environmental and fisheries-related issues and helped illuminate the plight of the right whale. Rob Martin has been working for years to find ways to continue fishing and protect right whales. He's been an early adopter of breakaway lines and sinking lines and is currently partnering with our scientists on ropeless fishing. Erica Fuller's work protecting ocean ecosystems is amplified by the Conservation Law Foundation's decades-long history of taking action to protect right whales, from successfully fighting oil and gas drilling within whales' habitats to taking on the federal government to protect whales from threats posed by commercial fishing gear. And you too can help ensure the future of the North Atlantic right whale, as you'll learn more about this evening. If you enjoy this program and want to help support our right whale work, please consider giving a gift to the aquarium's Mission Forward Fund at neaq.org. 2020 has been an extremely challenging year for us financially, as it's been for so many other organizations. We remain committed to safeguarding this species, and gifts to the aquarium help us continue to do our work. So thank you for your participation tonight and for your support. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Kelly Criss, who will be moderating tonight's panel discussion. Kelly is the Director of Ocean Policy at the New England Aquarium. She has held positions with the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, the U.S. State Department, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the U.S. Department of Interior, and spent a decade working for the nonprofit sector, advancing science priorities in the U.S. and abroad. Thank you, Kelly, for serving as our moderator, and now I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Vicki, for that introduction. Thank you to the Boston Globe. Thanks to all of you for attending this evening to learn more about the plight of the North Atlantic right whale and some of the work that's being done to save it. As Vicki mentioned, I am the Director of Ocean Policy at the New England Aquarium, and while we have done years and years of research to understand the North Atlantic right whale. I just want to tie that to the work that the policy program does to really use that information to inform decision making and advocate on behalf of the ocean conservation issues that the aquarium is so passionate about. Before we get started, I'd like to just make a couple of housekeeping points, much like if you were in person. So if you're not familiar with the Zoom feature, down at the bottom, you'll see a link for a Q&A. We would very much like to encourage audience participation this evening. And so we'd like to invite you all to ask questions of the panelists after we get past a couple introductory questions. And of course, the panelists themselves will introduce themselves. So if you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the Q&A. Just to make sure you all understand, if you are an attendee, you are not on video and you are muted entirely. This is a virtual event. It is being recorded. And for those of you who RSVP'd, which you did if you're here, you will get a link to a recording after the event has closed this evening. So with that, I'd like to just say, I hope you all enjoyed the film as much as I did. I'm really looking forward to talking with all of our panelists, and I'd like to invite them to turn on their cameras and join us at this point as well, and let them introduce themselves to you. They should be familiar to you since each one of them had a role in the film. So if everyone could please turn on your cameras. All right, we're going to go through and introduce David. We still don't have you on camera. Okay, there we go. David, if you would please introduce yourself to the audience.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is David Abel. I am the director of the film Entangled, and I'm also a reporter at the Boston Globe, where for about a decade I've covered environmental issues.
Thank you, David. Moving on to Dr. Peter Corcoran.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone out there in Zoom land. I'm Peter Corcoran. I'm now the chair of the Crouse Marine Mammal Conservation Program at the Anderson Cabot Centre at the Aquarium, which I've only been doing that job for a year. Prior to that, I worked at NOAA's Northeast Fisheries Science Centre, also doing whale work. And now I have the privilege of leading the team that have spent 40 years doing right whale work.
Thank you, Peter. Erica Fuller, if you could please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Kelly and Vicki, for hosting us tonight, and David for producing this film. I think it's really important work, and really glad to see it highlighted like this. I am Erica Fuller, a senior attorney at the Conservation Law Foundation, and I lead our right whale campaign.
Thank you, Erica. Rob Martin.
Hi, my name is Rob Martin. I'm a commercial fisherman. I want to thank David Abel for making the movie in the New England Aquarium. And I especially want to thank Scott Krause and Amy Knowlton, because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be where we are today doing a lot of stuff. And a big shout out to them, especially Scott. And I learned a lot from him, both of them, him and Amy. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, now that you've all had an opportunity to introduce yourselves, I'm going to go ahead and kick off with a question for all of you, and remind the audience to be thinking about your questions based on what you saw on the film. The question for everyone is, do you think that the North Atlantic right whales and the lobster fisheries can coexist? And if the answer to that is yes, how? And I'd like to start with Rob on this one.
I do think they can coexist. And what you need is you need fishermen, scientists, and engineers all working together to solve a problem. If you don't, you're never going to solve anything. And that's my belief right now. And like I said, there's a handful of us, not just a handful, but a lot of us that are trying to do the right thing. And when I got kind of thrown into this about 7 years ago, because I've been on my 7th year of a closure starting in February, it woke a lot of us up. And we've been using best available science, working with the scientists, working with engineers, and trying to dig through as much as we can to solve the problem. I want to solve the problem. I don't want to put a Band-Aid on it. And I want to keep on fishing in generations to come. I've been doing this now for 40 years fishing on my own. So, and I want to, not another 40 years, but close anyway, keep on going, and for younger generations.
Erica, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, I'd agree with Rob. I think it's imperative that both right whales and the fishery not only coexist but flourish. I mean, the fishery provides thousands of jobs in small boat businesses and throughout really the whole supply chain, which drives our economy. But right whales are also an important driver as an ecosystem engineer. They play a role in the air we breathe and the food we eat and in our climate as a carbon sink. So, through tourism and education, they also support jobs and revenues in coastal communities. So yes, I think they can survive, and I think both will survive. In terms of solutions, I think our short-term solutions in this country should be adaptive measures similar to what's being used by the Canadian government now, which would include closures in those areas of highest risk and mandatory vessel speed restrictions where right whales are there or expected to be. And I think the long-term solutions are continuing this transition to ropeless in those parts of the fishery where it's necessary, the development of near real-time monitoring of whales so we know where they are, dramatically improving the way we mark gear so we understand where entanglements are coming from and exactly what fishery they're coming from, and better enforcement down the road.
Thanks, Erica. I'm going to turn to Peter next.
Okay, and for the person who's asking about me being near the mic, I hope this is better. Let me know if it's not. Yeah, I mean, I agree with both what Rob and Erica were saying, and we know this species better than probably any other whale species in the world, and we know what the problems are, and we have ideas on how to solve them. We know we can do it if we choose to. It's really a matter of will, and as long as we all want to pull together and make it happen, I'm sure we can do it.
And well, let David, you can have the last word on this one.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to say thank you again to the New England Aquarium, which has done so much amazing work on this issue, for hosting this, and for GlobeDocs for hosting this. I think the short answer is I hope so. I hope that the lobster fishery and the whales can coexist. And the more elaborate answer is really they don't have a choice. It seems that for the whales to exist, there has to be, for the whales to stave off extinction, there has to be some way to better exist with the lobster fishery. And for the lobster fishery to continue to thrive based on court orders and proposals that are slowly, ineffably, perhaps making their way through the bureaucracy, they're going to have to find a way to thread the needle between the commercial and the conservation interests. So I just honestly don't think there's a choice. I would defer to Peter, Erica, and Rob, who have taught me so much about this issue, and everything I know really about this subject comes from these guys.
Thanks. I'm going to jump straight to a question that seems to be coming up frequently in the Q&A, but also one that I wanted to ask in the solution space, which is about the ropeless technology that was featured in the film. And so, Rob, I'm again going to start with you to please tell us about ropeless, what the pros of ropeless are, what the challenges are, is it ready to be deployed, and and then we can drill down into some of the Q&As that I'm seeing as soon as you finish with the big picture part of it.
Like I said, I'm February 1st, I'm coming up to my 7th year of a closure, which is over 3,000 square nautical miles. I was shut down for 3 months, but the actual 3 months is 5 months to get gear, and I don't fall the lobsters like I used to, and I still have bills to pay. So as this whole moved on, I'm getting to ropeless. we started doing a lot of homework, especially my better half. We put an organization, a dormant organization back together, the South Shore Lobster Fishermen Association. We started talking about looking at all the best available science. And as we decided, we came up with something that Amy Knowlton did, and we came up with a sleeve, South Shore sleeve for reduced breaking strength. It moved on from there. We tried to get back into parts of a closed area with modified vertical lines, and it didn't work. So from there on, I had both my nephews who are engineers now, one from Northeastern and the other one from UNH, both worked at a place called EdgeTech in Wareham, Massachusetts. That's been making acoustic systems and everything else for whoever for a long time. And we had this conversation where I didn't even know that they were doing that. And lo and behold, one thing led to another. My nephew was talking to my better half, Laurie, and they were talking acoustics. So one thing led to another. Laurie called EdgeTech, talked to Rob Morris. That was almost 5 years ago. And we were talking about acoustics, what to do. They're very expensive, and try to design it to go in just not just for the whole fishery, but just to try to get back into parts of a closed area to get back fishing. And it's not one size fits all. So another friend of mine, Mike Lane, was talking to EdgeTech to try to design an end trap to put this system in. And so EdgeTech changed their modem around a little bit, talking to them, and Mike Lane kind of said, hey, here's what we would like to have, an end trap weighted with this stuff in it. So things kept on moving on from there. Then I met Richard Riles from Smelts at a meeting at Woods Hole, and he does the lift bag, and I've got to know him pretty good and working with him. And we've been working with a bunch of different systems. There's 4 of us have been fishing the last 2 years. I've been fishing 4 different companies' modems with the total EdgeTech system, and it's been progressing every time we get together and talk and do something. And actually, we've been fishing the gear hybridly with a buoy on one end and the acoustics on the other end. It's not ready for prime time for everywhere. Like I said, this is just trying to get back into a closed area. If you get closed, back in Canada in the Gulf of St. Lawrence this past year, the snow crab fishery went to the EdgeTech gear and was fishing EdgeTech gear in a closed area for the snow crabs. Because as you know, back in 2017, there was a lot of deaths of right whales with entanglements and ship strikes. And the Canadian government closed a lot of area down in Canada. And so those guys decided, let's try to get back. They trawled their gear up, a handful of guys, and they were fishing the EdgeTech system. But I think it was a 10 trap trawl, but those trawls would go for over a mile. And to do that in a small, try to get a handful of guys to do it, just to try to get back in, to try to not break ground, but working with these companies with a lot of support with scientists who we have the Northeast Science Center, working with them, helping us with the engineers with EdgeTech and Smelts, how to fish this stuff and document it. And every time we go out and try it, we were allowed to see how it worked. We'd make changes. We've come a long way in a couple of years of fishing this stuff, but it's, like I said, it's not ready for everybody. It's very expensive. And to go back to try to fish, you would need support and money to equipment, at least equipment to go. Like right now, a handful of us have been fishing this gear, not all our gear. It's just been a handful of trawls we've been fishing for the last couple of years, just to keep on improving stuff as we go along. If I was in my 20s or 30s or 40s, I'd be paying attention to this stuff, because you still have a long way to go in this industry. And to me, it's like a cell phone. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the cell phone I have now, I couldn't believe the stuff that I could do on my cell. I can do everything on my cell phone, but 5-10 years ago, that was a pipe dream. But as time goes on and everything gets put together, and like I said, we're trying to coexist. I don't want anything to happen. Most guys don't want anything to happen to these whales or anything. We want to solve a problem. And that's why we've been working with these people right now to do this, with the engineers and scientists, to try to figure out a solution to the problem. And we just want support and just keep on moving from there.
Thank you very much. I'm going to follow on to that question with a thread that's coming through the Q&A as to if this is the future. And I'm looking at Erica and Peter for this question. If this is the future, why has the government just not mandated it? And there's a question about how would this get funded? So between the two of you, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I see Peter's still muted, so I'll go first. But I certainly am not a good person to get in the government's head. I can't tell you why they haven't mandated it, but it isn't ready for prime time in the time frame that many of us had hoped it would be. It's made huge strides in the last few years. I think what the federal government could do is it could ensure that there's enough funding to do the testing that's required, to ensure that it's safe, to ensure that it's legal. There could be an expedited permitting process. There's like several steps at which fishermen that want to fish with this gear right now have to go through. It certainly could be more streamlined, and the federal government could help make that even more streamlined than it is, than they've done so far. Certainly, I think immediate long-term protections are needed for right whales, but I'm not certain that the technology is there that this could be one of them that we require tomorrow.
Peter, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I'd take a slightly different sort of overview of it too, because there are places in the world where ropeless tech is being used by commercial fisheries, and that's being done successfully now for a few years. But they're fisheries that operate in a very different social setting from the ones in the US. And it's like one of the reasons why Canada's done a whole lot of things that the US hasn't done on the water in the past 3 or 4 years. And to get to the point about why is the federal government doing stuff, a lot of it has to do with the relationship between the federal government and the rest of society, and how that works in this country as opposed to, for instance, in Commonwealth countries like Canada, where the federal government ends up having more social place to come in harder than they can here. And I think, if the US wants to show that the US way of, running a society is the best way to do it, then, let's find some answers that are going to work here.
Thank you. David, I'm going to turn to you and go a little bit higher level right now. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk to the audience about what motivated you to make this film in the first place, and what were you hoping to accomplish by telling this story?
Yeah, thanks. And just to add my 2 cents to the last question, I think it's all about priorities. And what our priorities are as a nation. And, we do provide subsidies to a range of agricultural interests. We provide billions of dollars to soybean farmers and others. And so if we made a choice to subsidize a transition of the fishery, we could certainly do that, but it's a choice about whether or not we want to do that. So from the larger perspective about what drew me to this story and why I thought I should make this film. So in some ways, as others might be familiar with my previous films, this is sort of the capstone of a trilogy of films I've made about how climate change is affecting our ecosystems, particularly our oceans. My first film was Sacred Cod, which was about how the accelerating warming of the Gulf of Maine, which is warming apparently faster than almost any other body of water on the planet, had an impact on our iconic species, cod, And the following film, Lobster War, was also about how the warming waters were affecting the lobster catch and the lobster population. We've seen a decline in the lobster catch south of Cape Cod by some 90%, and we've seen conversely a increase in the catch off of places like down East Maine substantially, and that's what fueled my interest in that film. And as I started to learn more through reporting those films and those stories for the paper, I learned a lot more about right whales and also about how climate change was affecting their migration patterns, which we learn about in the film, and how the tiny plankton, the rice-sized creature called Calanus, their main food source in their summer feeding grounds, had been plummeting in some estimates by about 90%. That had an impact on their migration, and that arguably is what fueled their being found in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canadian waters, and what had led to 12 right whales catastrophically dying in 2017. And so these are the main things that I was really interested in. And last spring, the United Nations released this report about how by the end of this century, we are likely to lose as many as 1 million species. And I was just blown away by that statistic. And I wrote a story about it for the paper, but I just couldn't really wrap my head around that figure. And I wanted to try to make sense of that and try to tell that story. And I thought, how do you tell that story about such a large, incomprehensible figure? And I thought maybe you could tell it through one particular species, a charismatic species, one that people could identify with. And that's why I thought it would be worthy to tell the story of the North Atlantic right whale.
Thank you. And we're glad that you did tell the story. So I'm a scientist, and so I feel like it is incumbent on me to ask a science question. And so this one's coming to you, Peter. I'm going to build off of one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, but that has also come through, which is how do we know, the first question is, how do we know that there are 356 right whales left? And then the follow-up on that is, what does that mean for the long-term prospects of this species, and how long do we have to do something to prevent them from going extinct?
Thanks, Kelly. Well, we know how many North Atlantic right whales there are because we can identify all the individuals from natural marks, and they have callosities on their heads, and every single whale has its own callosity pattern. So they're all known as individuals. And, you know, the aquarium team keeps the catalogue of these whales that, you know, goes back to, there's actually a whale identified from a newspaper report in the 1930s of folks going out and seeing a whale calf and going, oh, great, we'll kill that. And, you know, someone taking photos of being in the newspaper, you know, we know who that whale was, the mother was, right? And the coverage of the right whales, the amount of field work done on right whales, I mean, apart from this year, which has been problematic, but is just extraordinary. And it's a huge collaborative effort run by, there's the aquarium, there's NOAA, the Centre for Coastal Studies, Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans, a bunch of universities. There's a huge group of people that all come together in what's known as the consortium to share data so we can understand what's going on with right whales. And from that, I mean, actually estimating their abundance is slightly more complicated than just tallying up how many we've seen each year. And technically, for those who like this stuff, it's a Bayesian state-space implementation of a Jolly-Sieber mark recapture model. But basically we throw some statistics at it, but we're seeing in the order of nearly 90% of all individuals of the species each year at the moment. And so we have a very good idea of how many they are and how they are. We know a lot about their health, their condition. We know who's having babies. We know who's due to have babies. So I think that covers the first bit. What was the second bit again?
What does that number mean for the long-term survival of the species, and how long do we have left to take action to prevent them from going extinct?
So one of the issues is there's actually basically 3 males for every 2 females in the species now. And that's come about because females seem to be dying faster than males are. And the problem is that since about 2010, 2011, their numbers have been in decline. They were kind of inching upwards from when fieldwork started, back in the 1980s or so. And they're increasing at a bit over 2% a year, which is never as good as it probably should have been, but it was better than them being in decline. And they peaked at a bit under 500 10 years ago now. And then they went into a decline for a bunch of reasons. And what it means is it's we have in the order of probably 150, 160 females all up, and I hate to say this to the guys, but we don't matter anywhere near as much as females do in mammalian populations, and we can't afford to keep losing them, because eventually we'll just lose them all. But they've been at lower numbers than this. The problem is the trend. We have to stop them declining. We have to flatten that out, and then we have to see them start increasing again.
All right. Well, we heard. Thank you, Peter. Before I move on to a question, there have been a number of questions about people who might have missed the film. And so I want to pass along that you will receive a link to stream the film along with a discount code in a follow-up email. So if you did miss the film, it sounds like you have another bite at that apple. I want to turn to Erica. We heard an awful lot about the role of lawsuits that are being as one of the tools that's being implemented to address the plight of the right whale. So we heard about a few examples that have been brought against the states and the government for their failure to prevent mortalities of North Atlantic right whales, specifically under the Endangered Species Act. Based on your work, what is the role of lawsuits in this situation, and have those lawsuits been successful?
Thank you. The role of lawsuits is to force long-term protections that aren't otherwise coming. In this case, a take reduction team process, which is a creature of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, had been playing out for years without any decrease in the number of deaths. And in 2017, when we learned that this population was in a really steep decline, since that time, federal fishery managers haven't put any protections on the water, despite the fact that another 32 whales have died and another 13 are dead or presumed dead. So in the absence of litigation, it does not appear that the federal government is likely to act on its own, under its own power. I was a large animal veterinarian for 20 years, and the reason I became a lawyer is because the power of the law had the power to provide these kind of protections that a veterinarian can't. It's a powerful, powerful tool, but in this case, the federal government has really utterly failed in its management responsibilities to date, I think, both to the fishery and to right whales. And litigation is one way to get their attention when other avenues fail. And our lawsuits have been successful. Last October, a federal judge in DC agreed that NIMS violated the Endangered Species Act when it opened up 3,000 square miles of ocean in southern New England without analyzing the impact of ocean waters on right whales. And it ordered the gillnet fisheries that were operating in that area to leave immediately. And you know, last year, a federal judge ruled that the same agency violated the Endangered Species Act when it authorized the lobster fishery without the permit that it was required to have. And it's ordered a rule for long-term protections to be published by May 31st, 2021. So I don't think it's the only tool. And of course, I don't, I think we're deeply appreciative of both the fishermen and the scientists and the advocates that have worked to solve this problem outside of litigation, but it is an important tool that in the absence of it, I don't think we'd have the progress that we are making.
Thanks, Erica. There's so many great questions coming through, but I want to build off something that you said, and I want to direct this to both Peter and Rob. You know, we heard one of the fishermen in the film say that he can't think of one thing that the National Marine Fisheries Service has ever done to help our fisheries besides regulate it to extinction. But we are also hearing that they aren't doing anything. And so I'd like to dig a little bit into that. Why do you think that there's this difference in perspective? And I think we've got a scientist who used to work for NOAA, and then a fisherman. So if you both would like to respond to that, I would be very interested in hearing your answer. I'll just call on Rob first.
Through this whole process, I said the last 7 years, I've learned got a lot of information and learned a lot. Actually, National Fisheries Service has been working with us to try to solve a problem and with help, but there's just so much layers upon layers to try to get stuff done. It's just, for me, it's mind-boggling, and everything moves slow. And we try to do something to get something done, take 2 steps forward, we get pushed back a step. But I'm not going to agree with National Fisheries Services. They've helped us out along the way in this process to try to figure things out and guided us to do the right thing and how to do things. So I don't agree with that individual's comment, so for the simple fact what I've learned the last 7 years and tried to do. If it wasn't for them, I'd still be, I don't know, I'd be in serious trouble right now. I know that, especially not knowing what's going on. So like I said, everybody's got to work together. If you don't work together, you're not going to get anything done.
Peter?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, Rob. Yeah, I think a couple of points worth bringing out. One is that the quality of the science that's coming out of the National Marine Fisheries Service on right whales is still excellent. And, you know, there's a dichotomy between science and management. And then I think another problem for the Fisheries Service is that it's primarily a fisheries service, and it has this responsibility for conservation as well. And particularly when one of the biggest conservation problems is the fisheries that the Fisheries Service is managing. The Fisheries Service kind of finds itself stuck and ends up not doing as good a job as it should of probably either sides of fisheries or conservation. And I think another thing worth bearing out too is that then it took a long time for the Fisheries Service to actually accept there was a problem with North Atlantic right whales. It was, you know, we knew there was a problem before 2017. And I can tell you from inside NOAA, there were people thumping the table and saying, we've got a problem, we need to address it. And until everything went to hell in a handbasket in 2017, we weren't being listened to. And, you know, that's the reluctance of a big bureaucracy. That's something that needs addressing generally. But I think all those factors come together to create more of a problem than there needed to be.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to David with this question and again bring it up a little bit to kind of the filmmaker's perspective. I, for one, am curious whenever I watch a film as to what got left behind. What pieces of this story were you unable to include? What got left behind on the cutting room floor? So if there's something that you wish had been included, what would you like this audience to know?
Well, there are a lot of things whenever you're making a film. There's so much. I mean, we probably interviewed 100 or more people for the film. Each of those interviews were lengthy. And so there's obviously only so much to make a compelling film coherent that you could include. But I'd like to answer that question by saying what's happened in some ways since the film ended. And, you know, this is a very much a live story. It's a difficult film to put an end to in the sense that the story is still unfolding. And as Erica and Peter and Rob to some extent knows, you know, we had to recut the end a few times as we were completing the film, just because things started changing. And I just want to tick off a couple of things that are noteworthy about what's happened since this film was completed. The first is that the film ends with a measure of hope in that we learned that there were 10 right whales that were born last year in the last breeding season. And we also doused that hope with a sort of dollop of reality in that we need roughly about 30 whales to be born each year to maintain a sustainable population. But since then, we've seen 2 of those 10 whales unfortunately die. 2 of the calves are believed to be dead. And then just recently, I think it was last week, as the breeding season started, we saw the first calf to be born this year die. Perhaps the calf was stillborn. We've seen a number of serious entanglements in which there are whales that are considered to be swimming while dead. And the other big thing that is noteworthy is that the film chronicles, the spine of this film is about this effort on behalf of this team of federal and state regulators, fishermen, scientists, environmental groups in the form of the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team. What I thought was going to be the ending of this film was it was the midpoint in the film, which was what seemed to be this historic agreement where nearly everyone, all but one member of this team, agreed to take what was considered historic action, which was to drastically, by roughly half, reduce the number of vertical buoy lines, the lines that go from the surface to the sea floor, the primary source of mortality for right whales now, to be removed from the water column. And unfortunately, that didn't happen, and there was a backlash, which we see chronicled in the film. But what we don't see is that the regulations that were proposed and were debated throughout the film have yet to actually see the light of day. And so more than a year ago, these regulations that aim to reduce the mortality or serious injuries of right whales by between 60 or 80% have been delayed They were supposed to be released, I believe, last fall. Then earlier this past winter, then in the spring, then in the summer, then we were told this fall, and then we were told after the election. And we have still not seen anything about what the federal government plans to do in response to the 25% decline in the right whale population since 2010. And these draft regulations are in some sort of regulatory black hole right now, sitting in an office in the White House, and nobody knows, nobody has been able to tell me when they'll be released, what they will look like. And it's really the only bookend that we have at the moment is this federal court decision brought about in part by Erica and the Conservation Law Foundation and her fellow plaintiffs. And there is this ruling that says that the federal government must issue regulations to protect the whales and reduce entanglements by the end of next May. But we don't know exactly what they will look like. And the truth is that that decision is somewhat vague. So, so when you ask what's on the cutting room floor, it's this unfolding story, really, that, maybe there'll have to be a sequel.
I was just going to ask, can we look forward to a sequel? Hopefully with more right whales at the end of it rather than less. Okay, there are so many good questions, and time is going so quickly. I'm going to ask a question that came through the feed, and I'm going to add a little piece to it. The question is, NMFS, being the National Marine Fisheries Service, seems to be caught in the middle. What are they supposed to do? They are walking a tightrope, and everything they do needs to be within an applicable law. At the same time, the government is slow and takes a long time. Every side is upset over regulating or not regulating enough. And so I would like to put that question in the context of some of the steps that Canada has taken. And so I'd like to explore the differences between the US response and the Canadian response, and ask, what is Canada doing that the United States has not done, and vice versa? And why has Canada been able to take steps that the US has not? And is what Canada has done enough? Or does everybody need to do more? I don't know who the most appropriate person to take that question on is. So if somebody wants to volunteer, if not, I'm gonna name somebody.
I'll start. I'm not sure I can remember all your questions, but I'll start with the last ones first. Is it enough? Canada has taken some bold actions to both close areas and to, do vessel speed restrictions. But no, it's not enough. They need to do a lot more. And right now, their Canadian snow crab gear continues when it's operating to pose a huge threat to right whales. The gear is heavy. They drag it. It's got the lethal and the sublethal effects. Sometimes they drag it all the way to the United States. Sometimes they get diagnosed. They get documented first here in US waters, but it's not US gear. We don't still have a good way to know with certainty what fishery gear originates in. So I think they've taken some really bold action. They've done some really good things, and they have tried hard since 2017. But unfortunately, their fisheries still pose a big risk, and their commercial shipping traffic poses a big risk. Those big boats going through the Cabot Strait are going at speeds. They need speed sometimes just in order to navigate the conditions and the currents they're trying to go in, but the speeds are deadly. And so I would certainly love to hear from Peter and others, but that would be my answer to your last question. They're doing a lot, but it's not enough.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the Canadians have done some really cool things. They're using acoustic detections because whales call, and you can put robot gliders out in the water that detect whales, and they operate regardless of the weather conditions or whether there's a pandemic hitting humanity. And they can be out 24/7 telling us whether whales are around or not. They're not perfect, but they're a lot better than the other tricks that we have up our sleeve. And the Canadians are using detections, acoustic detections, as well as visual detections of whales, to institute closures based on blocks that they've worked out what seems to be a reasonable sized block. And that's a step well beyond anything that's happened in this country yet. To pick one example, you know, the tech was all developed here, but the management application has come first from Canada.
Kelly, can I just add to my last comment? You know, to the extent what Canada has not been enough, that in no way lets the US off the hook. The US has a different legal paradigm than Canada does. We don't have, you know, heads of departments that can just declare like a czar tomorrow, I want your gear marked, I want your gear out of the water in 2 weeks. We don't quite have that, but we do have emergency authority under the Marine Mammal Protection Act to take some measures right now. And if, to the extent I'm sympathetic that the bureaucracy takes a long time and rulemaking takes a long time, and notice and comment is really important, it's important for the public to weigh in, I'm not sympathetic to the fact that they haven't done anything on the water since 2017, and they really need to do something now. If it appears that this rule is further delayed, or that even when they get a proposed rule, it's another 8 months to a final rule and another year or 2 years till it's implemented on the water, that is just simply too long for right whales to wait. They've got to do more now.
And I would just add, what was fascinating to me in the course of making this and my last film, Lobster War, which looks at the differences in the regulatory structures of the Canadian and US governments on these issues, it's night and day. I mean, what they say in Canada is all they need is a swipe of a pen to take action. And so after the catastrophic death toll in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 2017, again, when right whales showed up in Canadian waters or in the Gulf of St. Lawrence for the first time in any significant numbers in anyone's memory, they had no real significant protections there for them. And after losing those 12 whales, they did institute this sweeping set of reforms to have closures, the kinds of things that have been proposed here, but have taken a long time and much input and much jawboning to even be considered. And so there, in 2018 on the water, there were a sweeping set of regulations, and there were only, I think in 2018, there were no right whales to have died in the Gulf of St. Lawrence that year. And then they relaxed those measures a bit. And then in 2019, we saw 9 of 10 right whales die again in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And after that, they instituted this new array and tighten the regulations. And this past summer, this year, we haven't seen any deaths. So just to me, the intriguing part is just how slow and difficult and conflicted, as Peter says in the film, our regulatory process is. Whereas for the good or the bad, it's not as democratic by any stretch in Canada. But when their officials come up with a position, they can implement it immediately.
There's some compelling aspects to that solution. And before we move on to the question, based on that discussion, Rob, I want to give you an opportunity to react to kind of the differences between at least what you experience here in the United States and what you're observing in Canada.
I've been up to Canada a few times in the last few years, and I've talked to a lot of fishermen. I've talked to the Canadian government DFO about stuff. And it's, as David would say, it's two separate governments. And I don't want to get anything wrong, but the fisheries minister in Canada can just sign something, actually has more power than I think the Canadian prime minister himself, to do something in fisheries, to pass a law, a closure, or whatever. That's not the case down here. Good or bad, I don't know. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not good. We got a total different situation with more layers upon layers. And I don't know if I'm speaking correctly or not, but my gist of the situation was, as a swipe of a pen, he can change something as far as I know. And I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I'll fact check me on that. But I know, but behind the scenes, there is a lot of communication going back and forth to try to work on stuff, to do stuff together and tell what, not the other side, but what are you guys testing or doing up here? What are your thoughts on this down here? How about this? How about that? And just across country lines, it's not, the right whales go all the way up to Canada and beyond and down south in Florida in the Gulf. In a lot of places, they've been seen over in Europe. I think last year there was one showed up over there. And a lot, you can't really put anything on to track them unless it's an entangled one. You can get a telemetry buoy on it until that falls off. But a lot of places they show up, they don't know that they're there. They go where the food is. They have tails. And even with a closure, you're closed, but that whale doesn't know that. That whale can be outside the closure. And in my opinion, closures, I want to say a few years back on Cape Cod, there was 2 juveniles killed, maybe a third one, and those were all due to ship strikes during the closed season for trap pot gear, gill nets. There was punctuations calf. There was another one in Cape Cod Bay, and there was another juvie that was hit somewhere else. But those are all during the closed period for fishing, all killed by ship strikes.
And we didn't have a chance to get into that. And I would just want to recognize that we have just under 2 minutes left of this really informative panel. So I want to leave off with a question that has come up a couple of times in the Q&A. And I'd like for each of you, if you can, to answer what can individuals do to support the right whale, to pressure the government? I'm trying to scroll through. So do you have any advice for our audience for things that they can do?
I'll lead with the fact that we will one day see a proposed rule, and it would be great for the public to weigh in on the long-term protections that the government is going to propose, whether they're in agreement or not in agreement. It would be great for them to weigh in. Their voice matters. And as a complement to that, there is federal legislation moving through the House and the Senate, Save the Right Whale Act, which would provide 10 years of funding to transition this fishery over to ropeless fishing. It won't be enough to fund the whole transition, but it would be a great start, and they could urge their legislators to support the Save the Right Whale Act.
Peter, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks. To take a different tack, we've heard about the judiciary and we've heard about the executive, but the third arm of government that we haven't really talked about at all is Congress. And if you feel strongly about this, feel free to contact your congressional representatives and express an opinion to them. I mean, because they're there to represent you on this. And that's the arm of government we haven't talked about at all. So I'll just get that one in there now.
Rob, from your perspective.
I always say, ask questions where your food's coming from, not just seafood, because the bulk of your seafood comes from overseas. And if you saw where a lot of that stuff came from, you'd be very appalled. And on that next note, there was a lot of guys working to try to solve the problem. fishermen, scientists, and engineers. And like I said, you got to work together. If you don't work together, you're not going to solve anything. And you got to work together. That's all I can say. And get as much knowledge as you can, because there's a lot of misinformation, but try to get as much correct information as you can and ask a lot of questions.
Thank you, Dave. David, I don't know if you want to take this.
Sure. So before the election, when people ask me this question, I would just say vote, primarily because we need policymakers who are guided by science in making decisions. But what I would say now is that there are a host of organizations that are doing a lot of amazing work to better understand this species and to try to protect the species, and also to find ways to coexist with our vital, iconic fishery, the lobster industry. And one of those organizations happens to be the host tonight, the New England Aquarium. So if you won't say it, I will say that the New England Aquarium has been the leader for 30, 40 years now on this, 40 years now on this issue. And obviously the aquarium, like a lot of our cultural institutions, have suffered tremendously through the pandemic. So one simple way is to support the New England Aquarium.
Well, thank you for that. And I do want to say, just from the advocacy standpoint, for those of you that do want to do something to help the right whale, you can watch the New England Aquarium, our feeds. We often have opportunities for folks to write to their elected officials or participate in the process. And I would say that CLF does the exact same thing. And so between us and other organizations, we can help facilitate those communications to our elected officials, to the administration and others. And so we would welcome all the support we can get to help these whales survive into the future. And we want to support the fishermen who are also helping to make that transition, so that we can have both the whales and the fisheries flourishing in the future. With that, I think we've gone just a few minutes over. I want to thank you for participating this evening. And just as a reminder, you will be receiving an email with a link to the recording and also a link to the film. So for those of you who have continued to ask that question, you will get that afterwards. I want to thank each one of our panelists, Erica, Peter, David, and Rob, for participating this evening. And I wish you all the best in the remainder of 2020.